Hello everybody. This is lesson 8 of the lecture Macroeconomics. I will discuss slides 79 to 97 of chapter 2, the long-run development of economies. In this lesson we will work out the various reasons for structural change. As we have already observed on slide 37 of chapter 1, according to the production account, the long-run composition of GDP changes systematically. While the share of industrial production in total GDP is shrinking, this bright red area here, which represents manufacturing, heavy industries and construction. The share of service sector production in total GDP is growing. The share of service sector production includes industries like wholesale and retail trade, hotel and catering, banking, insurances, business services and private services. It is interesting to see that the composition of the labor force has changed in a very similar way. This diagram shows the development of the share of employees in these sectors in percent of all employees. Even the quantitative numbers range in similar categories. This means that the structural change in the composition of GDP exerts also adjustment pressure on the labor market. While classical industries shed labor, service sector industries take on workers. As we will see in chapter 5, when we discuss unemployment theories, under certain circumstances, which are quite plausible, this can cause unemployment. This diagram shows that structural change is not a modern phenomenon. Historical data for Germany reach back to the year 1850. Back then, the largest share in GDP had agriculture, nearly 50%. Since then, the share of agriculture has fallen to a level of about 1% only. The fact that the share of agriculture in GDP has fallen has two reasons. First, production in other sectors has been growing stronger, and second, prices for agricultural products have been falling. This is due to the tremendous increase of labor productivity in agriculture. For example, around the year 1900, one farmer only produced enough food for 4 people. In the year 1950, one farmer was able to nourish 10 people with his work. Today, one farmer can feed 133 people. We will discuss the impact of productivity growth on structural change later in a more detailed way. As the diagram also reveals, the share of industrial sector in GDP rose until World War II and started shrinking with the beginning of the 60s. It was then when the share of service sector production started its major increase. This diagram reveals, from the long-run perspective too, the composition of the labor force. As is obvious, the composition of the labor force followed closely the composition of GDP again. Why does, in the long run, value added grow stronger in the service sector than in the industrial sector? There are two major explanations. First, in the long run, demand for services grows stronger than the demand for industrial goods. We will discuss the reasons why. Second, for many industrial goods, prices fall faster than production quantities grow. We will have a closer look to this argument also. Each of both explanations is already sufficient to cause an increase of the service sector share in GDP. If both act together, this will increase the speed of structural change. Four explanations exist for the income dependency of the demand for service sector goods. The first is Maslow's pyramid of needs. This theory means when income grows, households increase first their endowment with necessary durable consumer goods like housing, furniture, household appliances, cars, and the like. These are all products which are important for living. Only after this endowment with necessities is completed, household demand services like traveling, restaurants, cinemas, theater, and sport facilities. Services which are typically not absolutely necessary for survival, but which make life more comfortable. Second argument is when incomes grow, most households prefer to have more leisure time. More leisure time activities cause, however, typically a higher demand for services like entertainment, sporting facilities, cultural events, tourism, and so on. A third argument for the income dependency of the demand for goods is when income is growing, net wealth, the accumulated savings of households, also grows. This is something we have analyzed in the first section of this chapter when we discussed the Solow-Swan model. Now, higher net wealth causes, however, a higher demand for financial consultancy, bank services, wealth management, information services, and insurance services. A fourth argument is when incomes grow, life expectancy also grows. That's a well-established empirical feature. Higher life expectancy causes higher demand for health services. With some simplifications, we can easily analyze the consequences of a growing demand for service sector goods on the share of service sector production in total GDP. Let's assume for simplicity that we can neglect intermediate production and that only service sector and industrial goods exist. So we postulate a two-sector economy. Let's use the shortcut Y, S for the quantities of service sector goods produced. PS is the price level for service goods. YI represents quantities of industrial goods, and PI represents prices of industrial goods. Since we've made the assumption that there is no intermediate production, total GDP in this two-sector economy equals the value of service sector production plus the value of the production in the industrial sector. The share of service sector in GDP is then equal to this fraction. The value of service sector production divided over total GDP with the value of service sector production plus the value of industrial production. We start now with an equilibrium on the market for services. So we measure here the price level for services, we measure here the production quantities. This is the supply curve for services, and this is the demand curve for services. If the demand for service sector goods is now growing for the various reasons we have just mentioned, the new equilibrium implies that prices as well as production quantities grow. So we have to shift the demand curve for services to a higher level. Then we find that the intersection point now moves upward. So we have a new higher equilibrium price and we have a new higher equilibrium production level. If we transfer this result now to the share of service sector production in GDP, we find that the numerator of the fraction grows faster than the denominator, since industrial production in the denominator does not grow on a percentage base. This growth is faster than this growth. As a result, the value of the fraction, the share of service sector production in GDP, grows. So in words, if demand for services grows faster as demand for industrial goods, the share of services in GDP is growing. If this theoretical explanation is actually the explanation for the structural change we observe in reality, the empirical income elasticity of the demand for services should be larger than 1. The income elasticity of the demand for services is defined as the percentage change of service sector demand in a given period divided over the percentage change of income. So if income grows by 1% and a larger part of this income growth is spent for service sector goods, the demand for services grows more than 1%. As a result, this income elasticity should be larger than 1. So, If we measure an empirical income elasticity of demand that is larger than 1, we know that service sector demand is growing stronger than the demand for industrial goods. This table shows the results of a couple of empirical studies that calculated the income elasticity of the demand for services based on representative household panel data for several thousand households for a couple of industrialized countries like United Kingdom, USA, France, Canada, West Germany, and so on. The results show that the elasticity is indeed larger than 1. It varies, however, over various household types. It is typically larger for single households compared to households with children. So, all in all, these empirical findings support the hypothesis that income growth causes larger share of service sectors in total GDP. The second explanation for the increasing share of service sector production in total GDP is the so-called productivity bias. The productivity bias causes the prices for industrial goods to increase stronger than the production quantities grow. In classical industries, the technological possibilities for productivity growth are larger than in the service sector. For example, in many industries, production is more and more carried out by automates or robots. While in service sectors, classical service sectors like hairdresser, restaurant, music bands, tourism, and so on, this type of productivity growth is not possible. It's not possible yet to substitute a hairdresser by a robot or a music band by robots, and so on. Now, under competition, such technological progress in classical industries causes a decrease of prices stronger than the increase of production quantities. Taken for itself, this causes a long-run increase in the share of service sector in total GDP, as the following diagram shows. So now we measure here supply and demand for the aggregated industry sector. This is the price level for industrial goods. This is the production quantities for industrial goods. This is the demand curve, and this is the supply curve. Markets for industrial goods are typically old markets where technological progress has already caused a long-run increase of supply. So the supply curve lies here, therefore, far to the right, and not here, somewhere here. Far to the right, indicating a large supply relative to demand. So the equilibrium price level is relatively low, and the equilibrium production is relatively high. If starting from such a market equilibrium, supply grows further, driven by technological factors mentioned above, prices will decrease stronger than production quantities grow on a percentage base. As a result, the product of price times quantity as measured by the rectangular surface in this diagram gets smaller. This is what we lose from our total production value due to the decrease of the price level, and this is what we gain due to higher demand and the corresponding increase of production. The loss measured by the red area is clearly larger than the gain measured by the green area. As a result, the total production value falls. If we transfer now this result, this graphical result, to the fraction that measures the share of service sector production in GDP, it becomes obvious that since the denominator of this fraction gets smaller, as we have found out here, the product of the new price level times the new production level is smaller than this product was before. So the value of this component of the denominator gets smaller, and as a result the fraction gets larger. If the denominator gets smaller, a fraction gets always larger. As a result, if supply of industrial goods grows such that prices fall faster than quantities grow, the share of services in GDP grows. As the following slide in the lecture notes shows, this increase of supply leads only to a decrease of sales if the supply curve lies that far to the right that the demand reacts inelastic. That means if prices fall faster than quantities. A third explanation for structural change, independent from the first two discussed so far, can be derived from the following newspaper article. As Levi's work is exported, stress stays home. You can download a PDF of this article below this video presentation, or you can click on this internet address to read this article on the New York Times. So please read the article and answer the question: what relation exists between the location decision of Levi's and the structural change in the USA? This third explanation for structural change is globalization. In the course of their economic development, many emerging market countries have successfully accumulated more and more production factors like human capital, traffic, communication infrastructure, public and legal security, which are necessary for the production of industrial goods. Since these production factors are offered at lower prices in developed countries, more and more industrial production is reallocated from developed countries like the USA to emerging market countries in Latin America or Asia. The newspaper report about the jeans producer Levi's is only one example from many. Consequently, the old industrial countries lose industrial production and specialize more and more in service sector production, where they still hold cost advantages compared to emerging market countries. Research and development, distribution and headquarter functions stay in the old industrial countries, while industrial production migrates to the emerging market countries. As a consequence, production quantities in industrial production decreases, while production quantities in service sector production grows, such that the share of service sector production in GDP grows. This becomes clearly obvious if we transfer these findings again to the share of service sector production in GDP. Service sector production, like research and development, distribution and headquarter functions, grow, while industrial production shrinks, such that the share of service sector production in GDP becomes again larger. So much for this lecture. In the next lecture we will start with Chapter 3, the neoclassical model and its policy implications.